nature. The Cholas, of course, one of the most popular monarchs. A very long-running rule can be at least more than 1,000 years, starting from what is generally academically referred to as the Sangam period, close to 2,300 years back. We have several poems in the Sangam anthology describing the valor of the Cholas, their rule, their just rule, the prosperity of the Chola country, their capital, their army men, and a king, and a lot more information about them. So one thing that can be very safely assumed is that the Cholas have gotten themselves rooted here in this part of India, synonymous with the Tamil culture and the Tamil civilization here, and become a very, very popular and an existing dynasty that ruled. Of course, the southern part of India has seen several dynasties like this, which have come from outside, which has been here, which has won over another and gotten itself established. Dynasties that fell down, that again, came up to power, rose again. So all these are there in the historic timeline of South India. So the Cholas, who were very popular starting from the Sangam period, did see a lot of dim light on them between when the Pandyas and the Pallavas rose powerful, and the Cholas kind of got sandwiched between a narrow stretch of land on the banks of Kaveri River, with the northern territories dominated by the Pallavas and the southern by the Pandyas. And history has its tendency to be, repeating itself. So there was another cycle of change, and then around the 9th, 10th century, the Cholas came back to power, and that is exactly where academically we speak a lot about the Cholas. But what we conveniently forget is Cholas getting themselves rooted here in this soil a good millennium before the Imperial period. That's around the 10th century. Of course, we have very popular names like that of Vijayalaya Chola, to whom we generally attribute the legacy of laying the foundation stones for the Chola monarch as we see it today. The second most popular name is, of course, Rajarajas, or in some cases, in fact, all that is Chola is about Rajaraja and Rajendra. So the father-son duo whose period turned out to be a milestone event kinds, their rule, very ambitious and dreamt big and managed to achieve all their dreams, concentrated in various areas, apart from just waging wars and extending their territories, setting up a regime that is strong, which is well wished by the people, which is supported by the civilian, which recognizes talents, which had patronized professions, culture, various forms of arts and culture, that which managed to bring micro governance in a very, very sophisticated fashion. All this was done at a very large scale, especially during the 10th and the 11th century, that which continued for a few generations after Rajendra. And the next turning event is around the time when Kulothunga Chola rose to power around the 12th century. From then on, it was more like a mixed fortune for them, rising up and coming down. But after a point of time, the dynasty that spread its arms all the way from the today's Arabian Sea, cutting across the oceans, extending itself beyond the Bay of Bengal and going up to the Southeast Asian countries, where the flag with the tiger printed on it was hoisted high, where the kings were brought down as people who were ruling as representatives of the Cholas, paying tax to them, giving them gifts. So this kind of a control. Major parts of what is today's India was under the Chola regime at a point, and then it kind of started shrinking. The Pandyas, who were working towards coming back to power for 3-4 centuries at a stretch, rose back to power again around the 13th century, and it was a huge blow. And several feudatories who were under the Cholas again regained their power, and that's how the Chola dynasty fell down. So this phase of the Cholas, starting from Vijayalayas all the way up to the 13th century, a dozen generations then, is generally the most spoken about part of the Cholas. If you draw a historic timeline for the Cholas, mark them starting from the Sangam Chola, the earliest known example, and just fill it down the timeline. That which is very popular will be between Vijayalaya to the end of 13th century till Rajaraja III and so on. So that's the timeline that the Cholas were active. But even within that, now if you start zooming into this stretch alone between the 10th to the 13th century, it's Rajaraja's period that's considered to be the most prosperous, a period when the people really lived very happily ever after kinds, time when documentation was done at its best. So majority of the available data, we can, as far as the Cholas are concerned, we can generally give it over to Rajaraja for meticulously processing the documentation. However small or big, a property has got to be documented. However wealthy or poor, a person's own land has got to be documented. The boundaries to be defined properly, and the tax was dependent on that. Many important judgments, cases that were conducted in the local courts, all that was documented. And with the king's interest in developing the nation, extending the nation in all possible directions, cutting across oceans and all that, the possibility of sitting in one corner of a huge empire, say Tanjavur probably, and taking care of law and order at every nook and corner in every village, cases that were small and big and all that, was not even possible in the times. Imagine 1,000 years back. So one of the most prominent aspects that was well attended, well laid out, and without any ambiguity put to practice was the system of local governance. And today's topic is going to be about the aspects, the highlights of local governance and how it helped the Cholas, the Imperial Cholas especially, be remembered for a lot of their decisions, social, economic, financial, managerial, all these decisions and policies that were made through learning, all that, how was drafted by the local governing body, how they were monitored and executed in the best way possible. So that's going to be our topic for the day. So with that introduction, so being imperial is when your kingdom is recognized for it being independent all by itself, and establishing a powerful army, setting up your norms, your regulations, having a kind of a code of conduct based on which the governance can happen. The law book, which was here, of course, it was not a printed physical book. The law and order that was maintained was more through the local learned, the committee of wise men, if I can call it that way, in every village. So they were bestowed with the power to govern the law and order in a particular village. So at different levels, depending on the size of the settlement, they were classified like how we have in today's context. We have the states followed by the districts, and you zoom in a bit more, you have the taluks, corporations. So there is a well-established hierarchy based on which policy decisions and all that will be taken. So there again, they had a similar setup based on which the norms, the regulations, the policies were all drafted and put to use. So the local village assembly, that's like the smallest governing body. If you break this hierarchy and zoom in and go down, the foundation was at the foundation level, you could see what was called as the local village assembly. Now, this village assembly had several responsibilities, one of which, and the most important one, was to maintain law and order. So any cases, criminal or civil, was all brought in front of this assembly, which was constituted by a group of wise men who have proven their ability, proven their integrity, their financial stand, and a person who was experienced, well versed in the Dharma Shastras, which were like the codified texts again. So you draw your conclusions based on the axioms put forward in the Dharma Shastras. From there, you quote and the judgments were given. So there were several positives to setting up a local village assembly to take care of the law and order in a particular place. Apart from that, being a bridge between the king who's sitting somewhere else in another, the capital city, and the common public was also the role of the village assembly. So if there was a common circular that has got to be shared with the people, it was on the village assembly leaders to inform the people about it. So conducting local courts, collecting tax, maintaining records, settling disputes again at a smaller level also, all of that was under them. So when I call it a court, it was, there were cases which were very special, which required the involvement of people who were really well versed with the Dharma Shastras. While petty disputes like boundary issues or property issues and all that could be settled at a very easy level because it was at a village level. The common public there were well known to the village assembly. Everybody know the other person. They were mutually well known, introduced already. And the property of a particular family, its boundary and all that was well known to almost everybody in the village. So there was very limited prosecutions, in fact. So when that is the case, delivering a judgment and establishing justice and all that was pretty simple. But there have also been very special cases, very specific cases where delivering the judgment or calling for a final decision was not, could not be done only by the local village assembly people. So that is when exclusive men had to be invited to sit and pass the, to be a part of the jury. So there have been several cases like that. One or two examples would be like one particular example wherein a woman was levied a particular tax, which she said she was not to be levied upon. She denied the charges that she has got to pay this tax. And on the other hand, the officer, the tax collector there, gave her a bill and told her that this is still pending, and so we will have to charge a penalty on this. She was very vehement. She said, like, no, there is absolutely no chance. I'm clear of these taxes. I need not pay these taxes. So this was taken up with the local court. A local court was commissioned with the people sitting there, and the complaint was by one of the officials, and she was asked to be a part of the enquiry, of course, and the kind of village assemblies where every village member could be audience to it. Being put to shame like this for a mistake which she didn't commit, the woman felt very bad about it and she committed suicide. Now she was dead, and what caused her death was this complaint which she denied. And now that she's gone, there was nobody else to establish her stand or to talk on behalf of her stand. So the village assembly, given the fact that the person who was on whom the charges were, he was an official too, they said like this was much beyond their capacity to sit and investigate. So a special jury was formed exclusively to inquire this. And the inscription lines very clearly say people from different states were invited. Within the Chola dynasty, of course, you had regional divisions that were called as states. So the wise old men from different states were invited to this village to constitute a new body to inquire and come up with a judgment. Unfortunately, with lack of evidences to prove her guilty or not guilty, they just went on to look at it as a case of sinning and not sinning. So the official who levied the charges on her, which ultimately caused her death, was fined a sum of 32 kases. Kases, of course, should have been weighed against gold, small quantity of gold. So he was levied a charge. And in many cases like this, the fine that has got to be paid was paid in the local temple. Yet another interesting case, like where a juvenile murder case. So a little kid was playing with a neighbor's kid. They were playing, two little guys. One was 6 and the other was 7 years of age. They were playing, and 6-year-old guy was handling an axe, his father's axe, and by mistake it fell on the other kid's neck and he was dead too. So this was taken with a local court, and on an inquiry they approached the case in a very interesting fashion. They said like there was no intention for the kid to cause this death. It was not a murder. It cannot even be called as a murder because he didn't want to kill him. There was no pending issues to settle or nothing like that. It was an accident, but still it has caused the death of one kid, and apparently the sin for having been a cause for someone's death will be on this little child. So as a pariharam to it, or as to repay for it and repent for it, The little kid's father was advised to set up an endowment to burn a perpetual lamp in the local temple. So that's exactly how, something as serious as death or, acts that causes someone's death and all that was treated. So it was more an approach. The law part of the assembly was more an approach based on pavam and punyam, and to ensure that the convict, if it is a case like this juvenile issue where the little kid didn't have any intention, but apparently knowing or unknowing he's caused the death of another kid. So it was more like praying for him to be cleared of his sin. So his father was asked to burn a lamp every day in the temple. So this is how, these are very small examples. There are several other cases, a few complicated ones like land dispute between the temple and village settlement, cases like, a false allegation, how that was met out, property dispute between brothers, and cases where a person caused confusion within the state against the king and how that was dealt, cases where the cattle were stolen and when they were retrieved and the guilty was caught, so how that was dealt. So there are a variety of cases, but there aren't anything that is major or the kind of assorted varieties of criminal acts that we have today. There was nothing much like that at village assembly level. And again, since the population was very small, the governing limits which encapsulated the population, that population was very minimum. It was very easy for them to investigate and come up with a justice to pronounce judgment. So this was one aspect of the local village assembly. Of course, there were negatives also to this. Like, for example, if you weren't convinced with the judgment that was handed over, there is no scope for you to approach a court which is at a higher level. Now we have courts at state level and then one at the national level. And so, the hierarchy thing was not there. So if you're not convinced with the judgment that was slapped on your face, you cannot approach another court. It is more like a final decision at that level. Though justice was very quick, this did lack, there was no scope for appealing again. Another thing, there doesn't really seem to be a profession as lawyers for having even existed during this time. Yeah, fortunately or unfortunately, there were no lawyers at all then. So if you are brought to the court, you will have to defend yourself. You argue based on the evidences that you have in hand, the witnesses that you produce, the arguments that you frame and put forward, the way you take it forward, and all that was on the civilian who has to defend himself. So this ensured that there was not much of, there was some amount of truth in what they spoke. So there were positives and negatives when it comes to the law governing part of the local village assembly. We all know, of course, about how the well-established democratic setup for a Ur Sabai was here in existence in Uttaramerur. A couple of points about it. A lot of people think that that is the first existing example for a well laid out setup for a village assembly election, but that was predated by a couple of centuries by an equally detailed, a similar inscription, if not equally detailed, from the Pandya period in a village called Manur near Tirunelveli. So that also speaks about how the village assembly performed, how it was constituted, what were its duties, how it worked and all that. So it was a couple of centuries after that, during Parantaka's time, that the Uttaramerur inscription comes into place. And Uttaramerur inscription, of course, is about the Ur Sabai or the local, for a particular settlement. The election for selecting the head and other constituting members for the village, was the local assembly of a particular settlement. So at that level, yes, it was very well established, but existence of one such extremely detailed inscription is not proof strong enough to say that a similar template existed in every other Ur Sabai, several thousands of Ur Sabais across the Chola country. We cannot definitely conclude based on that. So two things about the Uttaramerur inscription is it's one of its kind. Secondly, it's not the first of its kind. So now let's get to know about the village assembly and how the general highlights of it. It is to be managed only by men. Only male members could be a part of any village assembly. There is absolutely no example for a woman being a part of village assembly anywhere in any of the inscriptions regards to the village assembly that we have in hand. Each village assembly had different branches that work towards different areas. Like, for example, infrastructural development was one part of it. Taking care of the water bodies alone, because that's like the essential part of an agrarian society, be it lakes, tanks, rivers, embankment of rivers, to protect it from protect it when there is, there's a heavy shower and the river starts flooding. How do you manage the sewage canals, the sewer lines? So everything to do with the water bodies alone was taken care of by an exclusive governing body, which of course reported to the village assembly. Then, of course, you had endowments that were created to the temples. So that has got to be monitored. The temple activities, festivities, all that. Apart from that, of course, you should be having representatives from each of the community. What's interesting is the village assembly, when it forms itself, when there is a village congress that has got to get along and discuss and debate upon issues, it's really nice to see representatives from every different community. The kind of social strata that we have now, starting from the the communities that are generally associated with being at the top, all the way down to the bottom line. So there were representatives from every available community in the village to talk and discuss. It certainly was not dominated by a particular community or anything like that. You had representatives from various different communities getting along to discuss and debate and come to conclusions. So these branches had its own head, had its own working committee, and people who took care of it and who reported finally to the village assembly. So it was broken like this into fragmented into smaller subcommittees that worked for different developmental aspect of the village. Generally, the common public on one end and the king on the other end, and the people who bridged them were the village assembly representatives. Dharmashastras, smritis, local traditions, sometimes even regional beliefs, all of these form the basis of the governance. Now, Dharmashastras are like codified text, which has been updated over period. And we have different versions of it, believed to have been authored by different rishis. So it's been handed over, a part of the Indian traditional knowledge system. It is merely a reflection of how well planned and well organized the society was in the times that they were authored. Whether every law frame there is applicable not is it's a secondary discussion, not getting into that at this level, but it's just a mere reflection of the kind of detailing that existed in managing a government, which had layers of society, society at different levels, which formed together to get the dynasty and to put it into a framework. So these Dharmashastras played an extremely important role. The best part was most of the aspects of Dharmashastras which were to be used in the daily life, common public were well versed with it. You can notice very simple proverbs or phrases, lines that are even quoted till date, the people especially in the village, which are aspects of these kind of the essence of Dharmashastras and how they are brought about. So practices at a societal level, the belief system, and so what forms the governing body and the governance system, all that were derived from the Dharmashastras, the Smritis. There were, of course, local traditions and regional beliefs that played an important role too. So all of this put together made up the code of conduct that was referred to when there was a necessity. Special committees were deployed during very exclusive occasions. For example, if there is a force majeure situation that is to be handled, a special committee with people from various different fields of expertise were brought together. A special committee was there, and this part of the job to handle it was with them. So the committee functioned and performed till they were required, and then it was dissolved. So there are these examples where during special occasions, special committees were formulated from the village administration board. There were also religious committees which were managing the temples. Several thousand inscriptions on temple endowments, donations to temple, philanthropy, all that generally ends with identifying a group of people who were part of the religious religious committee that maintained the temples. Sometimes their individual names were also etched. Sometimes they were called more like a group name and then said like, with these people, I leave the management of the endowment that I have created. So it's on them, let them take care of it. Till the sun and the moon last, I give it over to them and they should take care of managing the endowment that is created. So there were these religious committees also that were functioning as a part of the temple. Then you have professional committees, like based on different professions that you practice. Of course, the agricultural domain, which dominated the professional uh, fabric there, was had different committees. Then you had for the carpenters, the artisans, mercantile committee that was also very strong, and they had exclusive privileges to travel between places, and nothing stopped them from traveling. Taxes on them, levied on them, especially because it's import and export and the duties that came along with it. So all this had a separate committee to monitor. So you had professional committees, you had religious committees, you had social committees. That's like a governing body within each of the committees, each of the communities. So you had such communal ones, and then you had committees for infrastructural development and more. And finally, one super powerful body, which is the village local assembly that governed all of this. Now, this is more at a village level. Then, of course, you have the towns and finally the urban setup. So predominantly from the inscriptions that we have today, we can classify these local assemblies into three parts: at the rural level, the town level, and finally the urban level. And depending on the economic setup, the societal setup in all these three different classifications, the committees and their duties, all that varied. Urban assemblies, for example, were majorly with the cities which housed the businessmen. Majority of them, the majority of the population would be the businessmen. So their committees and whatever was required by them, for them, all that was governed by exclusive committees. So the mercantile community, of course, in any civilization, in any setup, any country, at any point of time, when human society got itself established, exchanges, financial exchanges, and money or barter in any level or any form has become an integral part. So, managing that and maintaining that is an important part of the country's overall development. So they played a very major role in all these groups. So this is at the urban level, it was called as the Nattu Sabai. So that's at the urban level. Then you had the Ur Sabai, so which is more for the assembly of the villages. Local decisions that were taken from time to time, local information that has got to be passed on, all that was discussed here at the Ur Sabai level. So the Sabai was, it's the governing body. They had their own set of rules. There were periodic meetings that were held, and members had their own time to put forward topics and discuss. Till date, we have these kind of setups still there in villages. Some even by the government. You have village assemblies that gather around to put forward their views also, especially when the government had to frame policies. There are these kind of assemblies that are called for, and there will definitely be a democratically elected local leader, say a village administrative officer or an equivalent post, someone in the equivalent post who will call for the meeting. And in several occasions, you have every member of the village can be a part of it and discuss, put forward their views, and come to a conclusion. So a similar setup was there, and these committees usually gather in the temple or in a mandapam that was exclusively reserved for this, and or a stage that's just built in the center of in the village square where they met, discussed. And there is inscription about, there are information that we get about how a person was generally nominated to inform the timing, go around the village, calling people to be a part of it, to gather around and to be there at that particular time. We've seen them in cinemas, and till date it is still there in a few villages. In fact, the government has people who are employed to do this. They go around beating the drum, call people, tell them a time, and that it's a general circular or an information that has to be shared that all of you should gather around tomorrow morning at this time at our usual village square. And so people gather around there, and whatever the reason is all put forward. Sometimes even an MOM is made. So all that is noted, points discussed, then they agree upon something. So a very complicated situation like this, a very sophisticated, in fact, a sophisticated scenario like this is what we see in the Uttaramerur Sabai. The Uttaramerur inscriptions is being spoken about time and again. So it gives you the complete format, and most interestingly, the prerequisites or qualifications to stand in an election, to go and apply to be a part of the election, to contest in an election. So the prerequisites that one should have. That starts from owning a piece of land and having an established financial credibility and having a societal name, being well versed in the shastras. So all of this becomes a part. And so and of course, when the nepotism part was never encouraged, not just the son of a father who served the same committee before, but it gets extended into several other the next set of relatives also. So even within the blood relations, you cannot contest in the election. So all this was very clearly framed and seems like a very, very well laid out plan, given the fact that it was a little more than 1,000 years back. So the reason why the Uttarameru inscriptions are time and again spoken about. So salary sometimes that was given to people, like say for example, you have the committee that takes care of the water bodies. So you need to employ a person to clean the channels. Say there is a lake which is shared by the village, and so there are inlet and outlet channels that needs to be periodically cleaned and kept well. So a person for this has got to be employed by the local sabai, and there will definitely be a remuneration for him, a salary, because that's his job. So that part of it has got to be taken care of by the village. So what exactly is his remuneration? Discussions like this. The temple security, the watchman in the temple to be employed, and what are all his duties? Of course, one person cannot be there throughout the month, be awake through the night and take care of it. So shift system or employing more than one person to share the burden and all that was also there. So it just again gives us a clue about how thoughtful it was, how well thought and laid out in a very, very healthy, unambiguous fashion. The Sabai seemed to have had ultimate independence. There was very few occasions where the decision of the Sabai was ever contested or questioned upon. It was like ultimate independence that they had at their own level, working towards the welfare of the settlement, the people there, and ultimately contributing towards the might of the empire was what they all look forward. To them, the king is sitting somewhere, they are just the representatives, but there is a well laid out charter, and to follow the rules and regulations, it's easy to achieve your ultimate aim, which is like a well governed local settlement. So if whatever has to be done to achieve it was all done, so that made it very, very effective, and people started working towards it. So the independence of the Sabai is something that is to be appreciated, again, given the fact that it was a millennium back. So you have the Natu Sabai, you have the Nagara Sabai, and the Ur Sabai at three different levels. The Nadu was more like the urban centers, and the Nagaram was the town level, and the Ur is more like the rural settlements or small scale settlements. So there were three different Sabai and three different committees under them, different types of committees under all these three. So the classification goes on. There were representatives from the Ur and the Nagara Sabai to the Natu Sabai. Natu Sabai took a lot of important decisions. Sometimes they were a part of the king's own governing body. So there were representatives based on experience or their scholarship. People from the Ur Sabai and the Nagara Sabai were chosen to be a part of the Natu Sabai, an assembly that probably went on to even advise the king when there was a requirement. So that's another nice way to involve representatives from the grassroots level all the way up to the topmost position. And another information here, more like an anecdote, is that kids, women, old people, everybody was a part of the assembly. Whenever there was a meeting, there was no restriction. So every village member could be a part of it. Again, there is of course a restriction of the non-village members cannot be a part of it. They were not welcome to be a part of the village level decision taken. Most of the inscriptions, based on the judgment given and the way the cases are argued and all that, seems like there was a thread of unity that kind of kept them in place. So that kind of bound them together. The thread that is called as that which worked towards the integrity and putting them all together and winning over chaotic scenarios and all that seems to have existed best during the Chola period. So at a local governance level, several departments work together. As I've been telling, you had departments that work for the water body, you had departments that work for the temple maintenance, infrastructure, taxes, agricultural, profession called agriculture. So for each of it, there were different committees that worked. Every individual could participate in the assembly if you are a part of, irrespective of whether you're a part of the committee or not. If you were a citizen of the village, you were welcome to be a part of it. Calling people for the assembly and keeping it open and transparent was there. As I told you, a person to go around to beat the drum and welcome people to be a part of the meeting. So that seems to have been a popular way. So, that's still there in practice. So, welcoming people to be there on a particular day and time to discuss and finalize on the decision was all there. And so this kind of also helped in keeping your discussions and decisions very open and transparent. So this was kind of an across the table meeting, which was very transparent. Decisions sometimes, I mean, most of the time, decisions were taken through such discussions and not through voting. So, going behind an idea just because the majority wanted it was not there. Again, given the fact that there can be aspects which the local people were not sure about. So aspects that need to be discussed by people who are well versed in the subject was required. So it's more like inviting a discussion than voting for it. So I'm talking about finalizing on policies or decisions, not to there were elections to constitute the body, but when it comes to taking decisions, it was more vocal and over discussions that they decided what they want than going behind a point just because the majority wanted it. Social status, one's education, sometimes even the wealth, all that played a role in being a part of the assembly and being voiceful in an assembly. That's another scenario that we have seen. Positives and negatives both were there for a setup like this, but this has been in existence. So that was, it is more like the village head, and he with the established societal status and his education and all that, claimed a veto power when it comes to taking these kind of decisions too. Taxes at a rural level, we can very clearly say that at a rural level, the village assemblies seems to be very it is more like a separate republic all by itself. It has its own rules and regulations. Very few cases where the super authority, the king, directly being involved in a part of the village's decision. Mostly it was all at their level. So it's just like small republics all being put together. But they had the feel that they were a part of the Chola dynasty, and the pride was there. So they worked for the integrity of the complete nation. So local taxes were there in various different forms. For example, if there is a public market space, there were individual shops owned by a family or an individual. So there were taxes exclusively levied for using the space, which was public. So inside a market, say there were 20 shops, the 20 shop owners had to pay a tax for using the space to the local village assembly. So a part of this money will be used to, of course, maintain the infrastructure of the market. And part of it will go in for general fund that is required for the village assembly to keep it running. There are cases where local public, a well-established and a philanthropic individual, paid upfront for a few activities, and then there were money collected as taxes from others to pay him. For example, if there is a force majeure scenario, say there is a scenario where the river is getting flooded, and so the embankment has to be done at a war footing basis. So you will have to build an embankment. So if the village assembly didn't have enough resources, there was no time to go around collecting money from every individual in the village. For all you know, everybody might not be having money also at that time, because mostly all minor transactions at a family level was all done as the barter system. So when there was a requirement for money like this, the local philanthropist or a wealthy person in the village will pay money upfront. So that's like lending money to the local village assembly. That will be used at that time to attend for the emergency. And then over a period of time, money collected as tax from all the other households will be used to repay the individual. So in many cases like this, force majeure situations, or when there is a necessity in the temple activities. Now there was, to build a part of the temple or a new shrine. If there is someone who wants to come up front and pay the money, that can be used, and then he'll be repaid. So cases like where the village assembly borrowed money from wealthy people seems to have been there in existence. Repaying him back was there. So there were also cases where taxes were paid upfront. Advanced tax system was there. So instead of paying it monthly, now for example, every village on the banks of rivers or huge water bodies had a good amount of population who made up the fishermen community, who were part of the fishermen community. People who were given the privilege to fish in the tanks. So even that was, of course, it was brought out to the public, and whoever could bid can take over the rights to fish in the village. So an open bid was there, and then people who can fight in the bid, participate in the bid, and take the rights or privileges to fish for a particular period. So in such cases, paying it in advance was also there. And then the money that he's got to be paid monthly will be subtracted, and the deductions, whatever is remaining, will be repaid to him. So scenarios that are very, very popular today in practice seems to have existed then when it comes to local taxes at a very minimum level. So system of advance tax, getting, I mean, the local village assembly borrowing money from a person, the individual in the village, and then repaying him. Taxes based on the profession that you practice, the community profession. So that is very, very interesting to note. In many cases, you have taxes if you own gardens, handlooms for the weavers, depending on the number of handlooms in your house, there was a tax levied for that. And for owning gold and silk, there were taxes. To owning gardens, yes, there were taxes for your cultivation, the land, wetland, dry land. So there were taxes in various different forms, apart from just land tax. If you have an open land, it's a different way of taxing it. And if there is a structure on it, depending on whether it's a permanent structure or a temporary structure, there were taxes based on that. And so it's a buffet of different taxes that were available, and very interesting to note them. If there is a private well that you have to draw water for your own agriculture, yes, there was a tax for that also. So very interesting to note the different types of taxes that existed, and how meticulously they have been in taxing people for all forms of properties that they had to run the system. So about the officers who constituted the village assembly, it's interesting to note that most of these leaders who were selected by and large through elections, it was more like an honorary post. So there was no remuneration to it. There was absolutely no, there doesn't seem to have been a evidence for remunerating them. It was not a profession per se. All these individuals who made up the local governing body should have had their own professions. Businessmen, agriculturists, landlords, yeah, so all these different professions they were practicing. This position as a village head was more an honorary job. But however, the village assembly to function in a very healthy fashion without any issues in it, you needed people at the managerial and clerical level, and those jobs had to be paid. So there were paid employees too, like record keepers, or when it comes to check to the surveyors who need to survey and measure and keep a track of the log on the individual's properties. So these kind of designations, professions as a part of who were like support staff for the local village assembly, they had to be paid too. Two interesting technical terms are seen when it comes to these kind of paid job as a part of the local village assembly. One is a group called the Madhyasthargal. Literally translated, that means the people who don't take sides. So they were more like a part of the village assembly office, and they cannot take any sides. And in most cases, they were not a part of the deciding authority too. So they will have to keep records, take care of them. So, they cannot fall for one side. And so literally translated, they were like the people who were in the central line. So that's like the Madhyasthargal. Then you have the Karanathargal. They were more like the draftsmen and accounts keeping, surveyors. So this is the part that was on field. So when there is a transfer of power on a piece of property, so the original property documents have got to be checked. The surveyor will be sent to measure and see if the land that is described in the document is what is being transferred. Then after that is checked, the official records can be made and the transfer can happen and recorded in the village assembly. So you had surveyors, people who were like on field officers who had to support it too. And there is also this special cases where professions, exclusive professions that were a part of a village settlement, they can practice only within their village. Now, this is also there in an unofficial fashion till date. If there is an auto man if there is an auto driver on your street, but you are of the practice of going out and taking an auto from the main roads, or booking yourself an auto on Ola or other things. And if there is an emergency, you run to this chap who's parked right outside your house. You definitely deny and say like, well, you can go for your Ola auto and not ask me, right? So a scenario like this where there was a compulsion, a mandate, in fact, that the service staffs whom you hire, like carpenters, gardeners, and all that, should be from the same village, and they also cannot go out to the neighboring village and work. So a very, very structured and a tightly fit frame was the kind of system that existed when it comes to local assembly. And these guys were, had representatives in the village assembly too. And the village assembly, certainly, you can definitely not say was dominated by any person in common. There are several occasions where, for example, an inscription from this place called Thirumanipudi near Kadalur, a temple where a person from what we call a scheduled caste today, creating an endowment to burn a perpetual lamp there. So it's not that temples were dominated or the local assembly was dominated by any community. There were representatives from a cross section of the society, and to decide and discuss and come out with conclusions. So the responsibilities of the Sabai, as I told you, it was at different level: civil, infrastructural, support staffs, property issues, taxes. So everything that was required for the well-being of a settlement, you had different responsibilities that were played by the Sabai. And so this is more like a very, very structured system that existed. And so, for a fact that the popularity of the Chola villages, why they functioned so well, how did the network existed this strong that, they couldn't be questioned or contested. They couldn't be overthrown for like 3.5 centuries at a stretch. And, it just weakened due to various other reasons. So once when this strong setup was diluted by various causes and for various reasons, till then, the Chola monarch were very, very powerful and nothing could overthrow them. So this is how it existed. And there was a kind of a cooperative understanding between the local Sabai, the village assemblies. So when there were jobs that involved 2 or more committees, they came together to take over the responsibilities. For example, when there was a hospital that was functioning as a part of the temple, so the temple authorities will have a say there, and so will the committee that govern the hospital, the medical, the dispensary space there. So when responsibilities overlapped like this, they very clearly drafted the rights and duties that has got to be played by the committees, more than one, which had to come in to take care of it. When there were disputes between villages, now all of this is for what was happening inside the villages. When there were disputes between 2 villages, again, the village heads, the local committee, the local village assembly heads had to meet together in another common place. So, the representatives from both the sides were there. The village population, again, from both the sides were also there. And these discussions were handled. And if there was a requirement for an arbitration, you had to invite someone else. So where, there were cases like inviting someone from the neighboring village, or a person who will be more like a neutral authority to come and discuss and arbitrate between these 2 different villages. There are a few complicated cases where more than 2 villages had fought over rights over a water body, or there are very interesting and such individual scenarios. So where again the local village representatives from all the village that was involved had to meet together, and then a neutral person has to be brought in. Discussions between all of them had to be done, and then they finally come to a consensus. Taxes, I've spoken about it, and all the different kinds of taxes, and the occupation that was there. A few interesting aspects are the common public had to be educated too. So there seems to be an endowment created or an exclusive reservation in the funding, the annual budget, in fact, to constitute what is called as a Ramayana Mandapam or a Mahabharata Mandapam. These 2 itihasas, as again, like, the traditional knowledge wealth of our country, are like best explorations to know best to explore and know the way the values have been transferred, what we thought as good values, positive activities, and what you how do you react to scenarios, how do you take decisions to conduct yourself, to manage oneself individually, to manage a family, at a committee, at a settlement level, at a village level, and all that. So these two itihasas were popularized. As we know, Tamil translations have existed for these two works since the early Pandya period itself. So starting from then on, there were these endowments, philanthropy, or created exclusively, or fund allotted in the annual budget to construct these mandapas, probably in the village square, where the Pauranikas, the experts in commenting or delivering lectures on the Ramayana and Mahabharata, could be hired and asked to deliver periodically so that the village members can come sit and watch it. Of course, an extension of all this is when both these itihasas became very popular as performing subjects for performing artists, starting from classical art form to street theater form and folk, and all different branches of performing art has absorbed both these itihasas, primarily because these are like the ancient records for value system that we here followed. So if you take a temple administration again was very complicated. You had again representatives starting from the priest all the way up to the bureaucrats and everybody being a part of the temple committee, without any difference. When there was a theft in the temple, for example, let's take the case of the theft in Thirukazhukundram, a very popular case, in fact, that was brought back to life after a couple of decades. So, initially after the theft, the convicts couldn't be immediately identified, and so the case was probably postponed. And after a couple of decades, when it was reopened, it was identified that the temple priests, two of them, were also guilty. So they were also charged. The family property was confiscated. One person, of course, committed suicide, fearing public shame, committed suicide, and another person was dead by then. And the people who were involved in it, like the security man in charge of the temple coffers there in that temple, the priest, and so it was a group that drafted a plan to loot the temple coffers. So when it was found out, members, all people who were guilty, irrespective of their caste or community, were punished in the same way. So, when it comes to a temple administration alone, there are so many such complications that comes along with it. Records being maintained, and land records, and registrations that were done. So record maintenance. The best example that I can immediately think about is the fantastic story of Sundaramurti Nayanar, the episode in the life of Sundaramurti Nayanar, of how there was an old man who just walked into his wedding and starved it and declared that he was his slave. And there is a document signed by his grandfather which said that his family, generations after him, will all be slaves to this old man. And we know how the court was there in that village and then gets transferred to the village of the old man. And there was this document being referred, and how beautifully, the first copy that was destroyed by Sundar was a duplicate. So the system of having a duplicate or even probably a triplicate was all there. And so he suggests that the local records room be used to cross-check with the signature, the handwriting, and then come to conclusion. So a system like that, starting from the 8th century, has been in existence. So having a records room where these records could be cross-checked, all that has been in place till the Chola period also. So that's in fact, there is a reference to something called as Vari Pottagam, which is Vari Pustakam, or the log book for taxes. So the accounts book for maintaining taxes. So and there was another log book called as Nila Mudal, which is like the survey book for that settlement alone. So we generally say that it was more effectively done during Rajaraja's period to document the land owned by individuals, classifying it as dry and wetland, and levying taxes based on the product that was cultivated there over the years. So, all these were a part of, highlighted points on how these Grama Sabhais, or the local administration bodies, function. And individuals who donated for the welfare of the village, they were identified and they were also awarded in the village assembly itself. So, when there was a sudden famine and people started migrating from the village, went out of the village, there are examples where one individual who felt bad the people of his own village are leaving the village. So he came forward to support them, to host them and support them for a brief period of time. And by then they could reconstruct their economy and be back in the same village. So when this individual was identified and he was rewarded suitably in the Grama Sabha. So it seems to be a very, very sophisticated, well laid out system that they had in place when it comes to local administration. To me personally, out of several important reasons for the successful conducting of the Chola Empire, one very, very important thing is about the local administration and how sophisticated and transparent and easily approachable it was, and how the local courts were pretty quick and easy when it comes to delivering justice. We speak a lot about the art and architecture of the Cholas, their magnanimity through songs, and the historicity through inscriptions and all that. But I think there are enough to be learned through their policy making, local administration that they had in place, and more. I would want to attribute the success of the complete country not just to these very popular names of the kings alone. It definitely cannot be the individual's thing, but it was more, to me personally, the success of the people here at the grassroots level who strived continuously, fearing dharma, where a majority of them stood on the side of dharma and governed themselves in the best way possible. So they are in fact the primary building blocks could build this huge edifice called as the Chola dynasty, and very successful dynasty that could be very popular down the annals of history. I thank for this opportunity. Thank you, Advocate Mrs. Srimati, for this opportunity, and hope you enjoyed the session. If there is a possibility to take questions after this, I'm open to it. Else I'll close with this. Murthy Ellam Vadi, Yangal Mono Guru Vadi, Arul Vartha Yentrum Vadi, Anbar Vadi Parabarame. Ellam Sri Tyagaraja Kripai, Sri Tyagaraja Maharajo Jagate, Arura Tyagesa, Sri Guru
On this memorable Teachers' Day, I'm very happy that we could listen to you, sir. And congratulations, my lords. I understand that the Swaminathan Award, PhD Award, has been conferred on you.
Thank you, madam.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure, my pleasure.
Thank you for the enlightening session, sir, and congratulations for your award. Before moving on to the question and answer session, Mr. Ramji Nagarajan wants to know if there are books or any other materials that you can share for this information, sir.
To begin with, if you're just starting with if you're talking about only this local administration part, I would suggest Shri K. Nilakanta Shastri to begin with. And on the financial management and other things, there are individual articles that have been penned, and probably that will give you a good hand on this subject.
Thank you so much, sir. If there are any questions, you can please put on the group chat. Participants. Looks like there are no questions, sir. Thank you so much for this session.
My pleasure.
We've had the pleasure to have listened to your lecture on this special Teachers' Day, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you, madam.
Yes. Shall I close the meeting with everyone's permission? Mitra, can I close it?
Yeah, go ahead. Thank you so much, sir. It was wonderful listening to you. Sir, there's one question for you.
Yeah,
so
please.
Geeta Kerala Varma has a question for you. On what part of the caste system are such played in the laws of the land at that time? Is our question.
I'm not able to understand this.
Sir, if you did,
such...
take a look at the chat box, sir. She's texted
I'm seeing that.
Yes, sir.
On what part of the caste system are such played in the laws of the land at that time? I'm not able to understand it. Can you help me?
I'll unmute Geeta, ma'am.
Please.
I think she'll be a better person to ask you the question.
I wanted to find out what part the caste system played
All right.
in the laws at the time. Was it practiced or was it a legal laid out rule?
To be very frank,
that
there are
period?
very interesting cases of fight between members from two different castes. It's not a caste-based fight, but a case where the representatives were from two different castes, and there doesn't seem to be an importance or a privilege given over to a particular caste when it comes to being brought in front of law. The case was attended individually and the decisions given. So it's at that level.
So was it the same punishment meted out regardless of what caste you came
Yes,
from?
in most of the cases, yes. It was
And
more
was there a difference?
scenario based. It was more a scenario based one.
Okay, and was there a difference between what the punishment would be for a man or a woman?
There is not much of a recording. Going through inscriptions, we cannot definitely tell about this. For example, a similar mistake committed by a man and a woman and how it differs. I'm sorry, I don't have data on that part. I think they should have gone by the Smritis then.
Okay, because earlier you had said that all these official village posts were for men only.
Yes, that I'm sure, because there is no name of a woman that is recorded in any of the inscriptions here.
No, I was wondering whether that was because of a rule or was it just the practice?
Practice, madam. Again, like they don't seem to have existed a rule book. While they have been in the habit of maintaining tax records and accounts book and other things, getting a rule book, with sections and cases and how to approach and all that doesn't seem to have existed. So it is more like individual scenario that was considered.
So even these people like the tax collectors or the accountants, none of them were women, all were men.
No, there is absolutely no record for a woman being a part of this.
Okay, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. A question from Mr. Ramji Nagarajan, sir. I think he's asked, where was all these cases recorded? Temple inscriptions, yes. They're all from the temple inscriptions.
So Ms. Leena Shankar has a question for you.
Yes.
Leena ma'am, please ask your question.
Okay. Good evening, Mr. Madhusudan Kalai Chelvan. This is Leena from Calcutta. My question is that your lecture was based on the Uttarameru inscriptions, or your lecture was based on some other Chola inscriptions, number one. And number two, you mentioned about the economic conflict between the two villages like that. So when we read those things, so was it in the downtrodden people, I mean between the two farmers, or it was between the two village lords, or it was the feudal lords? I just want to know that thing, because my connectivity fell down, so I couldn't hear you properly that time.
To answer your first question, my lecture today was not restricted to the Uttarameru inscription. I just gave a small introduction to it. I mean, I just brought it wherever required. Two important learnings that I wanted to put forward was Uttarameru inscription is one of its type. We cannot generalize that every village in the Chola country had a similar setup. Part two, Uttarameru inscription is not the first of its kind too. There are inscriptions. The one very popular one is of course the Manur inscription from Tirunelveli from the Pandya period, early Pandya period, which speaks about an election and a democratic setup like this to choose your village heads. To answer your second question, it's more about the conflicts between two individuals. We have majority of the inscriptions about between two individuals. Some cases is between the official and a civilian. Some cases as issues between two different villages. So each of it is different.
Okay, so sometimes it was between the state and the individual, and sometimes it was between the individual.
Between the individuals alone. Sometimes it was between two different settlements also. State might seem like a not a very appropriate term here. Maybe like, the local village assembly versus the individual. or the village assembly of a particular settlement against another. So all these possibilities are there.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Mr. Madhusudan Kalaiselvan.
My pleasure, madam. A question from Ms. Saranya. It says, was there a discrimination in attending the Sabha? No. To be witness to it, to be an audience to it, as long as you are a part of the village, you are more than welcome. Were there different levels of court as well? Village, district, high court? No, I think I spoke about this. There was no hierarchy per se. A village court was bestowed with the right to come out, to spell out the judgment, and that's it. You cannot appeal to a higher court. There is no hierarchy as such. That's there.
Mr. Kalaichavan, I'm sorry, Avinash here.
Please,
my question probably stems out of ignorance, but I am given to understand that the Chola dynasty did actually have territorial jurisdiction across multiple nations, which as they are today. There are inscriptions saying that it had gone up to Indonesia.
Yeah. The Cholas, especially the Imperial one, for almost a couple of centuries together, they had their control extending all the way up to today's Indonesia and Kedah and all that. Yes. There, of course, the system there, the way agriculture is practiced, the societal setup need not necessarily be exactly the way it was here then. So, as you said, within the territorial limits, laws were there, and if it's another country altogether, it was not the same. It needn't necessarily be the same.
My question was more towards trade and excise. Could you say that they were the first persons to introduce maritime law as it is known today?
The Pandyas have done it much before that.
Okay. Thank you. I'm so sorry for.
Thank you. No, please. My pleasure. Another question, was there any book equivalent to the present constitution? No. As I told you, there doesn't seem to be a physical law book that existed. Something like, the constitution that we have, which spells out our rights and duties. No.
I'm sorry for interrupting again. My second question actually stems from the fact that we are in the High Court quite often. So the issue is at the High Court, there's the Manunidhi Choran statue, as you know. The story goes, I don't want to dwell on the story, but I'm assuming the Cholas used the divine right theory when they exercised power.
They call themselves as the descendants of Manu.
Such a situation or such form of justice being expounded when you're at conflict with something like the divine rights theory?
No, the thing is, the Cholas outrightly call themselves to be descendants of Manu. And they also time and again mention that they are followers of the code that Manu gave. And in some cases, they go a step ahead and say, I am 3 or 4 times more than Manu himself. So as I told you, the Smritis, like Manu Smriti, for example, the Dharma Shastras, were the foundation stones on which regional differences, as absorbed, as understood, as time passed, should have been taken into consideration and framing of laws based on that. See, for example, cases like even a murder, for example, which is considered to be a very high order punishment yielding thing and all that. The punishment given then was probably to burn a perpetual lamp to create an endowment there. So their way of applying the Smritis is way too different. So comparing it with what we have today and to stamp it as discriminatory or non-discriminatory and all that might not be a right thing to do.
Thank you, sir.
My pleasure.
Sir, can I ask a question, please?
Please.
Just wanted to ask, you said that the punishments were based on power punya type and the people were asked to light lamp. In case I was not a Hindu, I was a Buddhist or I was a Jain, what kind of, will I still have to go
you would probably have to support the local Buddhist monastery or the Jain temple there. They were pretty much quite active, especially in the imperial period. The Chola kings themselves have patronized several Buddhist and Jain temples.
So the punishment would be for the appropriate temple?
Probably.
Okay, thank you.
Because there are cases which involves land disputes with respect to a Buddhist temple, a Jain monastery and all that too. But the same local Sabha seems to have governed it and taken care of it. The land donated exclusively for a Jain Jain monastery will always be called as Palli Chandam, which is like the Samana Palli or the Jain Palli, or the Buddhist temples will have different word to be used. So, but governed under the same local body.
Simple pleadings are literally, it's not even a request, but more than the presentation, the information that you shared is so vast. I wish there was a written format somewhere. If you could share or make a presentation and share, it would be a yeoman service for me. I am working as a school teacher. I would love to use it. I'm in a different state. I would love to use it and showcase the wealth of Tamil Nadu in particular as a pride Tamil.
You can definitely check with Sri K. Nilakanta Shastri, the most authentic version of Chola history.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
So there's another question for you, sir.
Oh yeah, please.
On the chat box. Was the Madhyastha equivalent to the Speaker of the Lok Sabha?
Okay, Speaker of Lok Sabha. I wouldn't call it that way, madam, because the Madhyastha Lok Sabha Speaker is more like the person who conducts the meeting, who leads it, who could establish his or her power on the members of the Sabha and all that. But here, the Madhyastha was more like an officer in charge, not to lead or convene the meeting or to conduct it, and all that was not a part of the Madhyastha's job. So he was more on neutral duty, like maintaining records, for example. A person, a scribe who was learned to read and write, but he shouldn't make any errors or shouldn't do something that would favor a particular individual or a party. So that way, it's a Madhyastha is at that level, not to sit and convene and conduct the meeting. Is that all, madam?
Assuming there are no more questions, sir, congratulations on the award, sir, and a very happy Teachers' Day. Abhirami will conclude now.
So I would just like to reiterate that this particular award that sir has been honored with is the Tamil Heritage Trust Professor S. Swaminathan Heritage Award 2020. This is basically to honor his contribution in deepening the public's knowledge of Indian heritage. Thank you so much, sir. We have had a pleasure of listening to you. Heartfelt congratulations, sir.
My pleasure. Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Can we conclude the meeting, sir?